I want to start with that stone right there. It's worth a really good look. You see what it is. It's a frieze of sheep, right? That's all these pieces around you are archaeological debris found in the excavations on the first of the hills, and a lot of them come from the original Hagia Sophia. The original Hagia Sophia did not look like this. It was a basilica. And we don't know an awful lot about it. It's hard to reconstruct, but this is the old St. Peter's in Rome, right, which Constantine built. And there's good reason to think that the old Hagia Sophia looked rather like this. That it was a basilica, and as a basilica it had a sculptured frieze, and that's a piece of it over there. If you have some time to look around here, all the original liturgical furnishings are gone. They're long gone. But there is an ambo, an early Christian ambo out here in the garden. It isn't from here. It was from what was called the Bayezid Church, and they found it. And you can get some idea of what an ambo is like, although of course it's a good deal smaller than the one that was in here. But at least you'll have set eyes on a real early Christian ambo from which the readings happened. The speeches were delivered. The patriarch didn't speak from the ambo, he spoke from his throne, except of course John Chrysostom was quite famous for leaving his throne and mounting the ambo so that everybody could gather around and really hear him. But that's what it was. It was a speaking platform.
The ambo is where?
Pardon?
Where is the ambo?
It's out here in the garden. You can't been put back together and they've mounted it here in the garden. But in here you can get some idea of the fact that the building itself is the image of the glory of God. There is no historical evidence of any kind that there was figurative decoration in this building before iconoclasm. In the building itself, no murals, nothing permanent in the building, in the walls of the building. Instead, the building itself is the icon and the achievement. As I'll explain later at Sergius and Bacchus, part of the reason this building is so huge and enormous and sumptuous is that there was a kind of building competition going on between Justinian and his greatest potential rival for the throne. Right? I'll explain all that later in Sergius and Bacchus when we're quiet in Sergius and Bacchus. So the sumptuousness, the gorgeousness of the building has a little bit to do with that. He's trying to outdo her, but that's a cynical version of the story. And of course, building a temple for God, Justinian would be guided in a lot of ways by Holy Scripture. There's a famous story in the chroniclers that when the building was finished, he walked in and said, "Solomon, I have outdone you," which, by the way, was also an answer to this lady who was his rival, because she said, "I did as well as Solomon." Once again, just as was the case, small of the Chora, you see that it's decorated with a wide variety of marbles. There are 9 different kinds of marble here. To get them, you have to go all over the Mediterranean. They come from quarries all over the Mediterranean. You'll remember that Justinian's the restorer of the empire. And in a certain sense, therefore, the marbles are not just gorgeous and beautiful, they're an expression of the accomplishment he did for God. He restored the empire to Christianity, right? So there's, in some ways, it's a microcosm of the empire as well as a microcosm of heaven. So be looking out for all the different colors that you see. The white is the grayish white is pre-Canisian, the green is Antica Verde, and so on and so on. Doors, door frames, columns, capitals. The place glittered. There was mosaic. You can see it here. It's non-figurative mosaic, right? So the point of why do that? The point of the mosaic is that mosaic creates, each tessera creates a reflected light, and you can see that they're mounted in such a way that the light is going to be scattered all over and magnified. And that's all part of the effect. Once again, you have to think in terms of Byzantine lighting, not this kind of lighting, right? And also, since movement in this building was constant, it's lighting that's constantly on the move, right? So the light is moving from area to area, and that goes along with the idea of ceremonial. The ceremonies involve so many processions, especially in this building where we don't have the two side chapels that normally accompany a sanctuary. Nobody's really quite sure how they did the great entrance here. There's been a lot of argument that a building called the Skeuphalakion, which still remains, it's the only part still remaining from Constantine's Hagia Sophia. It's on the outside, on the north side, was where the altar of preparation was for that part of the liturgy. But if that's so, it meant that they had to carry outside the procession of the great entrance halfway the length of the building before they could get in a door, and possibly, all the way to the western end to bring it in, because that's where the royal doors are. It must have been really, really something. Already in Justinian's time, the staff of this building was 500 clergy.
Justinian's time is 530.
Yes, Justinian's, this building was finished in 537, first time. And then he had to do it all over again, as I'll show you. We have to realize that this building is a complete freak. It's a total oddity, right? And it's not quite clear to me why it has taken on the kind of mythical role it has taken on in the idea of Orthodox worship. Certainly it is the great church, no question about that, but that's because of the liturgy. That is, it's the cathedral liturgy of this place that for several centuries influenced, spread, Byzantinized other liturgies, took them over until the idea of the monastic liturgy trumped even the cathedral liturgy of this place, and now what we have is a kind of mixed monastic cathedral liturgy. In that sense, certainly this is the great church. In the political sense, of course, or the administrative sense, it's also naturally the great church. It's the church of the patriarch. Did people care very much? Once you got outside the kind of central area of the city, sort of like, do Catholics care when they get outside the Vatican? Think about it. But in the sense of the building itself, it's a complete freak because of it's gigantic. And gigantism is not typical of Orthodox architecture. It is typical of Orthodox imperial architecture. So there are really only two or three places in the early Orthodox world, the early Christian world, where we get this kind of gigantism, and they're all associated with the imperial idea more than with any kind of ecclesiological idea. So you get gigantism in Rome. This St. Peter's that I showed you was the biggest building in the West until the monks of Cluny built their third church. Then that became the biggest building in the West until the new St. Peter's was built. This was, by a long chalk, the biggest building in the East. There are a couple of other places where you get gigantism. I think you want to think liturgically. What's the liturgical effect of gigantism? But of course, this is not a parish church, and never was. Right? This is a church for imperial ceremony. This is really where one can pull out, where the full organ is playing, where you can pull out all the stops. Just for example, the medieval ambo, we're not quite sure where it stood. You see these 4 stripes of Antica Verde in the floor? Right. There's gallons of ink have been spilled over those 4 stripes. What are they? Why are they there? What are they indicating? Are they liturgical markers of some kind, like, chalk on a theater stage? No one's quite sure. but we do know roughly the liturgical fixings here. And what we had was a big synthronon. That whole apse area was filled in with a gigantic synthronon. Remember, 500 clergy here, right? It came out as a low solea, and then there was an enormous ambo, kind of where that gang of people standing between the next two stops. There are medieval paintings, manuscript illustrations of the whole choir standing under the steps of the ambo. Right? Now, watch out. Remember figura, right? Did the choir literally stand under the ambo? Who knows? It's figura. It's a way of showing order. But the thing was probably that big, right? And you can also hear from the acoustics. You notice how you can hear everybody who's on the other side of the room? That's the effective acoustics of this place. Now, to talk about the building itself, we talked about the building as the image, right? It's unique in that respect, too. There are 4 Justinianic buildings standing in the world. Every one of them is unique. Every one of them is a different solution to the problem of church building. All of them are on this central plan. This is the moment when the big experiment is happening, and we're switching from the Basilica Hall style plan, right, which was borrowed from the Romans and a fairly good plan for a processional church, to central planning, which has all kinds of symbolic overtones of order and unity and cosmos and so on, but nonetheless makes a liturgy that is fundamentally a processional liturgy complicated. You go into a central planned building. Where do you move? Where do the directions take you? And this is partly why we get rubrics, why we start to get books of ceremonies. The most famous of which was written in the 10th century by the Emperor Constantine IX. Simply telling you where you have to go, what you have to do, and the ceremony by that point has become hugely elaborate and complicated. Now, what makes this building solution very interesting, right? The dominant thing is, of course, the dome. The dome is quite famous. Right? Now, you were just in a Middle Byzantine plan building where the dome was elevated on a drum, and you notice that's to get it up higher so it becomes a marker in the city, so you can sort of see it and know where it is. But you notice how it made it hard to see that there's a dome there? You actually had to walk to where it was and look up to see that there was a dome there, otherwise you were in a square building. In point of fact, and this is a big surprise, you're in a basilica, but it doesn't look like it. So everybody calls this a central plan church. It is not. It's a long hall with a central axis right into the sanctuary, just like any basilica. Rather interestingly, the axis is oriented a few degrees off the east. And the question partly is why they did that. And the answer is really extremely simple. They aren't using compasses. They're using the sun. And so it's exactly in line with the sunrise of the winter solstice. So that's the east. That's the liturgical east. But it doesn't look like a basilica, and the effect of a dome, which is to span a broad space and open it up, is wonderfully achieved. Now, how is it achieved? The dome is buttressed along that long axis by 2 half domes. You see that? So think of that. In effect, what they've done is take a dome, saw it in half, move a half here, a half there, plunk another dome down in the middle of it, and these 2 half domes are resting on these gigantic piers that you see, these 8 gigantic piers, and according to them, that's going to hold up the dome. Well, it is and it isn't. Right? this building is in a lot of ways a very good illustration of what I was saying this morning, that if you want a building to stand up, get it built by a master builder, not by a theoretician. This building was designed by theoreticians. The two architects, Isidore and Anthemius, were mathematical physicists. One of them was a professor in the university here, right? So they designed the whole thing by geometry. Now, according to them, that should really make it stand up because geometry is perfect. You see? And so they figured out how they could do this, but the original dome was much, much lower. It had a very flat profile, sort of like that, right? And it simply could not resist a shock. So in 553 there was a major earthquake, and the whole eastern half of the dome fell. The original dome fell. Justinian was even still alive, right? 553, 6th century. Justinian was still on the throne. And I wonder if he remembered his remark about Solomon, I have outdone you. Rather interestingly, he hired the son, Isidore the son, of the elder Isidore, to redo it. But I think the son must have consulted master builders, because the new dome is much more of a true dome. A true dome is basically an arch projected in 360 degrees. So you think of an arch and then rotate it. That's a dome. That will stand up because it has the tensile strength of an arch, right? Master builders know that kind of thing. You see? But even that dome has fallen twice more. So there was a major, major earthquake in the 9th century, and another one in the 14th century, right? So it's had to be repaired several times. But what's revealed there is that just a piece of it fell, and it didn't make the roof fall in, because it's a true dome, right? So they could repair it. Also revealing is that in the 14th century, when they were going to the repairs took forever because they were broke. In fact, there was a case that should be familiar to many here. One of the Slavic rulers sent a ton of money to repair the dome, and John Kanakazunis, who was emperor at the time, diverted the money to defense. So the repairs took a very, very long time. Nonetheless, the basic elements of it are sound, but to keep the thing up, they've had successively to buttress it. So if we won't have time probably to walk around the outside. Maybe we will, but if we do, you will see that on all four sides, there's had to be additional buttressing. So the original, remember, was really what these geometers wanted. It was a cube, right, with a longitudinal axis and a big dome over it, looking like nothing's holding it up, right? And it's great, except it won't. If a building doesn't stand up, it's not much of a building. So already they were buttressing this building in the 8th century. During the Latin conquest, they added the flying buttresses that you see, because the Latins knew how to use flying buttresses. And the massive, just weighty stone buttressing on the north and south was added in the 14th century. The Muslims buttressed it some more when they erected those that madrasa that you see out there. There's a Muslim madrasa, a school, and a cemetery on the south side of the building. Okay. The expression of the building as not a building, that the building is kind of weightless, is created by this effect of the revetment, the marble revetment. Just look at the variety of colors there, right? The red is called Sinan marble, and it comes, I think, from central Italy. So there's the breaking up of wall surfaces, but especially you see all the carving on the pillars and so on, right? That's all done with a drill. That's not classical, right? Classical capitals are shaped, and the shape is part of what's called the architectural order, and they're supposed to look solid. They're supposed to look like they're holding the building up. So in fact, those capitals are massive and quite solid, but the surface has all been totally undercut. The usual metaphor is that it looks like lace, right? And that's to give the effect that the building is really just a kind of floating spider web. It's a visual trick. Double layer of columns, as you see. One of the things that shows that these guys kind of really weren't practicing architects, if you notice the columns of the gallery, the second tier, they're not load-bearing down to the columns of the first tier. Big mistake. Shouldn't do that. That's the way it's done, because it's all about numbers. They're all playing with numbers. We'll be walking. I was told by people who have just been here that the scaffolding is gone. The scaffolding is not gone. There it is. It's just that it isn't out here anymore, which is nice. And that means that one of the things you can see are these mosaic angels, which were almost impossible to see before in the pendentives. So that's quite remarkable. First time we've seen that. You have the massive piers because they're holding up the dome, but then you've got your rather typical colonnade, right, of columns with an arcade. That's characteristic of a basilica. But then at each corner you get a little round. Instead of going in a straight line, the columns make a semicircle. It's called an exedra, and that gives you the illusion of a polyconch, a multi-face space, even though in fact it's really a great hall. That same solution is used in one of Justinian's other churches in Ravenna, San Vitale, on of course a tiny little scale. While we are here, the mosaic in the apse. Achtung, Achtung. Achtung, Achtung. We're about to dive. The mosaic in the apse is perhaps the most famous and the most controversial of all the figural mosaics here. There's a very famous sermon of Photius the Great on the rededication of the church after they had repaired the roof from that earthquake. And of course, this is the century after iconoclasm. And he talks about, but in very general terms, about the image of the Virgin in the apse and her effect and her protection on the city and so on. And again, gallons of ink have been spilled over whether it's that image. Because what Photius describes sounds like a hodegetria. Sounds like a virgin holding a child in her arms. Right? And the icon of the hodegon, which is gone now, it's hypothetically the one that Luke painted, except it actually appeared in the 11th century. You all know the type. She's holding the child in her arms, and either with her left hand or her right hand, she's pointing the way, showing the way. But the type, so there's a little confusion there. This is the early Christian type of the Mother of God. So when we start getting images of the Mother of God, right, that's what they look like. She's enthroned. She's the throne, right, on which Christ is enthroned. She's hieratic rather than narrative, right? She's central on a gold background, as you see. And those who want to argue for pre-iconoclast mosaics say that was there because it's so early Christian looking, and the iconoclast just covered it up, right? And so it's really very, very old. It's pre-iconoclastic. There are arguments at the other end of the scale that say that image is a replacement image for what Photius is talking about, and it didn't go up until the 12th or even the 13th century. So you pays your money, you takes your choice, but there's a long bibliography about that. Suffice it to say, it's part of a whole group of icons that are setting the pattern right after iconoclasm, in the sense that the dominant subject for the semi-dome of the apse becomes the Mother of God. Right? That becomes kind of standard in the program in one way or another. The Virgin of the Sign or the enthroned Virgin are one of the types. Yeah. Now, if you look across, you can really get the idea that this place was not designed for an iconographic program. If anything, the pendentus are the obvious space, and there are those who argue that the angels are pre-iconoclastic. But if you look at what was put in there right above the gallery, see the presence of the galleries, that's typical of a basilica. And it just doesn't leave you much mural space for iconography. So you see how they've kind of jammed it into what space was available, and it's way too tiny to see. But again, as Father Taft said, it's not quite clear that their notion of seeing is the same as our notion of seeing. As we say, to know something you have to see it. I'm not sure that they would say that. I think they might say putting in the iconography is an attempt to give order, right? To gloss the text of the building, and certainly to be theologically assertive that we can put icons in the great church. That iconoclasm is dead. So you can see who it's like a row of saints. It's way up too high. In the Middle Byzantine program, the row of saints would be down at our level, and we'd be praying in communion with the saints, in the communion of saints. One of them, you notice, is probably the archbishop the patriarch under whom it was done. His name happens to be Ignatius, but he's not Great Ignatius. Great Ignatius is the fourth one. So it's church fathers. So it's a rudimentary attempt at a iconographic program, but the only real success is the Virgin in the apse. And even she, given the gigantism of the building, is very, very reduced. Whereas in a small building, it's very focal and dominant. So the gigantism of the building, apart from the cost, the gigantism of the building is probably a liturgical aberration, and it's one of those situations where just kind of everybody gasps over Hagia Sophia, and I don't know why, other than it certainly is a unique building and a bit of an achievement. Nevertheless, one of the superb icons of the world is right there. That's a 13th century mosaic. So once again, you can see that what they're doing is taking advantage of any available space. It's not really programmed. There's no apparent order to what is where. They're just filling in wall spaces that they happen to have. So the icons are quite individual. It's almost as though they took portable icons and writ them large and put them up on the wall. But nevertheless, as an expression of 13th century iconography, this is a spectacular thing. In the 13th century, a lot more rhetorical emotion came into both preaching and the visual arts. Now, be careful when I say rhetorical emotion. That is emphasis on feeling, but not in the immediate personalistic sense that we use these terms today. That's why I'm trying to be careful. But there was a feeling of anxiety, and it showed up in the art as well as in the preaching. And I think the face of John the Baptist is an extraordinary thing up there. and the face of the Mother of God too. It's just a fabulous dais. Okay, these are the two famous presentation mosaics of the imperial families. They're separated by almost a century, and they're the only two that have been found. So, but they're enough to have made the argument that this gallery that you see around you was the imperial loge. That's the main reason for thinking that it's so. Plus some various textual indications that the patriarch himself brought communion up to here and so on. But you notice what they are. It's the idea of the imperial family as protectors and gift givers, right, under the protection of Christ and the Mother of God. So there's a sort of mutual exchange of gifts there. They make an interesting pair. Christ has a codex in this one and a scroll in this one. So the two basic forms of book. This is from the Komnenian period in the 12th century, a period when things were, in one way it was a cultural high watermark in Byzantium, and in another way things were starting to get a little dicey, and the Crusades were going on, and relations with the West were getting more and more strained. But this one's really quite interesting because the empress is Zoe, famous Empress Zoe of the 11th century, who went through a series of husbands. The husband you see there is husband number 3. And if you look carefully, you can see very clearly what happened. They just kept, the mosaic must predate him, and they just keep changing the head, as you see. And you can also see it, look at the first word of the inscription. They've changed the name as well. This is the second of the three Justinianic churches in the city. If you can possibly do it, I really recommend you go to the third, which is Hagia, because it has some very original architecture, and it also still has its 6th century synthronon, which is really worth seeing just to get the experience of a synthronon. This building, from an architectural point of view, is also unique, in a lot of ways more unique than Hagia Sophia, which is basically a giant basilica with perks. But this building, not only is the building spectacular, but there are some spectacular stories associated with it. So it's a double wall building, but this time the outer wall isn't a square masking the inner shape. It's the same shape, so the octagonal aspect is being very powerfully expressed. So why? What is an odd shape for a building, and certainly makes for a very odd shape liturgically speaking. Where do you go? Where do you stand? How do you organize the liturgy? But the symbolism of the octagon is very, very powerful. It's because of the number 8, which is a perfect number. Baptismal fonts in this period have 8 sides, as you know. But the real relationship is to these Constantinian churches rebuilt in the Justinianic period in Jerusalem, which you notice are giant basilicas, but the shrine part is arranged in an octagon. So the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or the Church of the Nativity in Jerusalem, and that's what's being reflected here. Even so, it's an oddity because the octagon is off. It's off kilter. So you see, we came in what is now the only door, the central door. As with all Justinianic buildings, there were 5 doors. Now they've turned them into windows. And you walk in and suddenly the octagon is off kilter. And the question is, why is it off kilter? That gets coupled with the fact that the south wall is different from all the other walls. And it turns out that this building was attached to a large basilica right next to it, Basilica of Peter and Paul. And so the question arises, what's this for? You've got the big Basilica of Peter and Paul with a monastery right there, staffed by monks. So what's going on here? Now, the name of this building from the beginning has been St. Sergius and Bacchus in the Hormisdas. It is okay to sit down if you want, Father. In the Hormisdas was a palace. Now you really have to use your imaginations. This is part of the palace complex. The great palace of the emperors stretched, here we are, we're right on the coast of the Sea of Marmara, stretched from here to Hagia Sophia, right up to the Hippodrome. So if you're walking along the Hippodrome, right, and you look to your left, if you're walking from Hagia Sophia along the Hippodrome, you look to your left, nowadays you see gardens, parks, shops, buses, and the Blue Mosque. But then you would have seen the great palace complex with all of its churches and its sub-palaces and its... Remember, the whole imperial family had to live there. What your name was showed your rank in the pecking order of the imperial family, and so on and so on. Right? The Hormisdas was given to Justinian, still as a relatively young boy. Justinian was kind of a poor relation of a family that had become imperial. That was also a kind of poor relation, jumped up family, the family of Justin. And so they're acutely conscious, right, of their status, that somehow the office of emperor has fallen into their hands, but they know that the old nobility regards them as kind of jumped up and tricked out. Now comes the controversy. If you look at the monograms on the capital, much the same thing we said in Hagia Sophia is true here. The use of many colored marbles. You notice the pattern. We have these wonderful piers, right? 8 wonderful piers, and then in between them are double columns, and this time the columns alternate between antique verde marble and red Sinan marble, so that you get this tremendous, and also true in the second, in the gallery level, so you get this tremendous play of colors and variety, and the whole building just has this constant energy. Procopius, who was the secretary of Justinian and wrote a whole book called The Buildings of Justinian, called this place the dance of the spirits. So then we have the same kind of carved capitals that are not in the classical spirit of being solid objects that are holding the building up, but rather carved out to look like smoke and air, so that the building is kind of miraculously holding itself up. And then the column bases are made of Prae-Canisian marble, very, very expensive stuff from an island out in the Sea of Marmara. So it's that kind of construction. But here, unlike Hagia Sophia, if you look at the monograms on the two faces, here they say Justinian Basileus. Right? They don't say Justinian and Theodora. And that was the first clue to the idea, an idea spread about by a chronicler, a Monophysite chronicler named John of Ephesus, that this church was built under Theodora's direction. This whole story is going to be a story about women. Under Theodora's direction, because there were a whole lot of refugee Monophysite or Miaphysite monks coming from various places in the east where they were being persecuted, right? Persecuted by Chalcedonians. And Theodora had set herself up as their protector. He suggests there were as many as 500 of them, right? Which is a little bit exaggerated. You have to remember this guy was the abbot of this group of monks, and he was himself a Monophysite and had a fairly serious rhetorical axe to grind here. But his claim is that Justinian and Theodora had moved on into the imperial palace and gave them the Hormisdas as their monastery. So that this was the Monophysite chapel of the city, right? With the monastery being the palace that was attached to it. Well, nowadays, we're pretty sure that's not true. And it starts to look, especially from this monogram, as though this project was started when Justinian was not even married to Theodora. He had just moved into the Hormisdas palace. There's a different woman in the picture. The other woman is named Julia Ancina, and she was from the old nobility. She was the granddaughter of Theodosius the Great. And she had a son whom, in her view, was the natural candidate for emperor, and was the one that Justin had prevented from becoming emperor. So she saw... By the way, what you're hearing is a good example of what our guide was saying, and a very good illustration of the dilemma of modern Istanbul. That's the railroad line. All railroad traffic from this city goes on that line. All. So a train goes by roughly every 5 minutes. It's destroying this building. The effects on this building are very deleterious. In big trouble. Anyway, Julia built what was the grandest, finest standard church in all of Istanbul, maybe even in all in Christendom. It's called St. Polyeuctus. It's famous in the chronicles. It was over on the Golden Horn side, right by the seawall. There was a whole cult of St. Polyeuctus. And her building was resplendent. You know, she took Justinian through it apparently, and sort of said to him, you see, I have matched Solomon." So says the chronicler. So Justinian obviously had this team of clever or thinking architects. And therefore, when they were given the opportunity by the Nika riots of 532 to rebuild Hagia Sophia, they could start to apply the lessons that had been learned here, but do them on that enormous scale that you saw. And of course, the competition in rhetoric is Justinian saying, Solomon, I have outdone you. There is a lot of question about the idea of Justinian supporting a group of, being willing to support a group of Monophysite monks, Justinian as the defender of orthodoxy. And the whole history of the story, as you can see, is fraught with all kinds of questions that need to be redone in terms of modern historiography and modern thinking. The old story comes from the old cliche about Justinian and Theodora, namely that he was totally under her thumb and just sort of did what she said, and she wore the pants in the family, and he was a willing participant. This story actually, or an unwilling participant, this story actually comes from Procopius himself. Procopius wrote another book. Remember, he was the big palace insider, Justinian's secretary. He wrote a book called The Secret History. And in The Secret History, he dishes the dirt. And there's a lot of dirt. That book's been readily translated. You can buy that one anywhere. People like to read dirt. To read the buildings, you have to buy the Loeb Classical Library volume, but The Secret History is the source of this opinion that Justinian was under Theodora's thumb. Now, actually, during their time in the Hormisdas Palace, they both did a whole lot of good works. There was a hospital right over there, staffed by monks. Theodora set up a convent for fallen women. This is very interesting because Theodora herself, as you probably know, or maybe don't know, was the daughter of the bear keeper of the Greens. And her way of making it in society was actually change parties. When she married into the imperial family, she joined the Blues, all of which was part of leading to the Nika riots. It's a complicated story. But it offers some suggestion about how very significant a role women played in society, in church politics, and even in theology, because you see that the story is mixed up with Theodora's fairly well-known Monophysite views. And so there's a certain dynamic about the religious situation right after the Council of Chalcedon in this building, tied up with this building. One of the things Justinian and Theodora did was to build connections. The Hormisdas Palace was a standalone, so they built a connection. The great palace became this enormous web of interconnected buildings. There were pathways and gardens. It's just been a whole book published on the gardens, garden culture. But nonetheless, one could live in the great palace and basically never set foot on the earth. There was a connection from the great palace all the way to Hagia Sophia, which the emperors used when they weren't having to make ceremonial entrances like the ones you saw in the mosaic over the royal doors and so on. Now, if you look at the solution for the dome, what we have is it keeps the octagonal aspect of it alive, because here we have these odd-shaped piers so that they present one face in this direction and one face in that direction, and that gives 2 pendentives per pier, so that you end up with 8. But you can see inside that the way the dome is constructed is out of 16 sections. It's what's called a pumpkin dome. So there are 16 distinct sections, like slices, but they alternate. One is flat and one is bent. One is flat and one is bent. That's what's responsible for that wave that you saw outside. But the result is this rippling effect. It's just really, really spectacular. And then, if you look at the arrangement of the columns, you can see we have 4 flat sides. Now, part of the argument is this inscription. And this is very fortunate to still have this here. But in most of the churches of this period, these are founding inscriptions. And you see how it works. The inscription is a gloss on the text of the building. So the function of the inscription is to explain, to bring out, to evoke, right, the spirit in which this was created. And so the inscription refers to Justinian and to Sergius. It never mentions Bacchus. But by the time this building was built, Sergius and Bacchus were always a pair of saints. They were military saints who were martyred in the Diocletian persecution. And once again, that's, I think, probably nothing to do with the Monophysites. Why would they care about Sergius and Bacchus? It was a response to St. Polyeuctus, who was also a military saint, who was also martyred in a persecution, although it was the Decian persecution instead. So everything nowadays goes to suggest that what we're seeing in these fabulous, gorgeous, right, highly enriched, sumptuous buildings of this period, right, is a reflection of social dynamics, social theology, search for validity. All of that's tangled up with the idea of offering this great gift to God.